Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? For 52 weeks straight, without missing a single Friday, I transferred $600 to my parents' account, always labeling it household, because that was what they told me it was for bills, groceries, gas, and whatever medical expenses they swore were piling up. I never questioned it, never asked for receipts, never hinted at any conditions, because part of me thought this was what good daughters did. You see your parents struggling, and if you are in a position to help, you just step in and do it, no questions asked. It became such a routine that I could almost predict the text messages I would get from my mom on Thursday night, little nudges reminding me of the upcoming bill or extra doctor visit that apparently made the Friday deposit all the more urgent. And the sad part is, I never thought I was being taken advantage of, not until the day the family trip was announced. The group chat started buzzing with plans and reservations, and I realized my name was nowhere on the itinerary. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. Maybe I was booked separately, maybe they forgot to copy me in, maybe something about the airline or the hotel had gone wrong and I would get my confirmation later. So I called my mom, expecting a quick explanation, but she danced around the question like it was something she had practiced. She said things like, "It just worked out easier this way, and you've been so busy with work, we didn't want to bother you with planning," and every vague sentence made me more uneasy, because I knew she was dodging something, but I couldn't yet put my finger on it. So I called my dad. And my dad, in his usual blunt, no-filter way, cut through all the excuses and hit me with the line that still echoes in my head. He said, "You weren't wanted. It's simpler without you." I cannot tell you what that moment did to me, because it wasn't just about the trip. It was the accumulation of an entire year where I had bled out $600 every single week, trusting them when they said they needed it, rearranging my own bills and tightening my own budget so that I could make sure they had what they claimed they could not cover. And now, after all of that, not only was I left out, but the official word from my father's mouth was that I was not wanted. I remember just sitting there in silence, my phone pressed to my ear, trying not to give him the satisfaction of hearing me cry, and all I said back was, "Okay." No fight, no begging, no pleading, just okay. He probably thought that was the end of it, that I would swallow it like I had swallowed every other insult or dismissal over the years. But that one word was the beginning of something he did not see coming. That night, I opened my banking app and scrolled back through 12 months of transfers. It was all right there, clean and undeniable. 52 weeks, $600 each, totaling more than $30,000. I clicked export and saved the file. Then I went back through old text messages, and it was all documented. Every "could you cover this?" from Mom, every "we'll make it right later" from Dad, every Friday reminder. I had more proof than I even realized, because I had never deleted anything, and they had never been careful with their words. I created a folder on my desktop and titled it Household Proof, and for the first time, I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't desperate for their approval anymore. I had receipts, literally. The next step came quicker than I expected, almost automatic. I logged into my budgeting app and found the recurring Friday transfer, the one that had been running in the background like clockwork for a year. I canceled it. Then I renamed that budget line from Household to Audit. It sounds small, but in that moment it felt like the first brick in a new foundation. I wasn't going to yell, I wasn't going to beg, I wasn't going to explain myself into exhaustion. I was going to document, to build, to prepare. I realized I didn't need them to admit they had used me. I could make the truth undeniable without ever raising my voice. When the next Friday came, no money left my account. I waited to see how long it would take before my phone lit up. It did not even take until noon. Mom texted me, "Did you forget?" and Dad followed with, "Where's the transfer?" And all I replied was, "No more transfers." I didn't elaborate, I didn't justify, and I didn't apologize. I wanted them to feel the silence the same way I had felt it when they excluded me from that trip. That was the day I decided I was done playing the quiet provider, the invisible backbone of a family that had no problem cutting me out of their plans the moment it was inconvenient to include me. I wasn't going to argue with them, because arguments fade and get twisted in memory. I was going to do something better. I was going to build a record so strong that no one could deny it, not even them. I did not argue. I documented. The morning after I cut the transfers, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, a cup of coffee that went cold before I even touched it, and a determination I had never felt so sharply before. Because for the first time in my life, I realized that my parents' control over me had always thrived in silence, in my willingness to accept half answers and let things slide, but now I had a weapon they couldn't twist or downplay. I had the kind of proof that doesn't get lost in arguments, the kind of proof that can sit in black and white on a page and leave no room for reinterpretation. I pulled every single bank statement for the past year, highlighted every $600 transfer, and carefully lined them up in a spreadsheet where each row carried the date, the reason they had given me, and sometimes even the exact wording of their request copied from old text messages. As I built the file, it began to look less like a family's private arrangement and more like a ledger. Documenting a debt owed, and that was when I knew I wasn't crazy, that I hadn't exaggerated, that this wasn't just about me being too sensitive or misunderstanding what was going on. This was a real financial trail, consistent and undeniable, and I wasn't going to let them keep rewriting history the way they had always done. The most cutting part of my dad's remark, "You weren't wanted," kept replaying in my head, and after scrolling through old voice memos on my phone, I discovered that a casual recording from a family dinner months ago had accidentally captured him using almost the exact same dismissive tone, saying something about me not being needed in every decision, which was not identical, but close enough to reveal a pattern of how he really viewed me. I clipped the audio, saved it as a file, and placed it alongside the spreadsheet because I knew that if this ever escalated to the point where the wider family became involved, hearing his words in his own voice would carry a weight no amount of denial could erase. For a few hours, I hesitated on whether to keep this private or whether to bring in someone from the outside, because there is always that ingrained loyalty that whispers, "Don't embarrass the family, don't make it public, don't drag outsiders into private matters." But then I thought about the group chat filled with vacation details, the one where they hadn't bothered to include me, and I realized that they had already decided my feelings were irrelevant and my loyalty disposable. So why should I continue protecting them at the expense of my own dignity? I called my Aunt Lila, who had always been the most practical member of our extended family, the one who volunteered at church committees, and who always told me growing up that facts matter more than feelings when people start arguing. I explained everything, down to the last detail, and when I asked her if sending the ledger to the adults in the family would be too much, she paused and said very clearly, "Facts are not petty. Just send what is accurate. Leave the adjectives out and let the truth speak." So that is exactly what I did. I drafted a short 2-paragraph note that was almost clinical in its tone, just a straight timeline. For 1 full year, every Friday, I transferred $600, totaling over $30,000 at my parents' request. I attached the receipts to show the pattern, and I attached the single audio file so no one could claim this was some grudge-driven invention. At the end of the note, I added one single sentence that was not up for debate. Effective immediately, I am no longer providing financial support, and any plans made assuming my contributions will continue were made without my knowledge or consent. That was it. No insults, no emotional outbursts, no guilt-tripping, just the bare bones of reality presented as cleanly as possible. When I hovered over the send button, I felt my hands shake, not because I doubted the truth of what I had written, but because I knew this would shatter the carefully curated image my parents had built over the years, the image of being self-sufficient, the image of being generous hosts, the image of managing fine without any help. The moment those relatives and church friends saw the spreadsheet and the attached proof, the story would no longer be one they could control, and once the truth was out, I knew there was no pulling it back into secrecy. Still, I pressed send. And the moment the email left my outbox, I put my phone face down on the table and walked away, refusing to sit there waiting for the reactions to pour in. Because I already knew the storm was coming, and I wanted the satisfaction of letting them feel it first. For once, I wasn't the one scrambling to defend myself. For once, the facts were carrying the weight, and all I had to do was let them land exactly where they belonged. The day after the ledger and audio files had been sent, I woke up to a quiet house, not the kind of peaceful quiet that invites reflection, but the hollow, unsettling silence that immediately signals a shift in balance. The kind that hits you in the stomach because the familiar background noise of casual dismissals and offhand comments was gone, leaving space for consequences to speak for themselves. And as I moved through the day, checking my email only once but repeatedly imagining the reactions on the other end, I realized that the silence was not empty at all, but charged with tension, because every unanswered message, every unreturned phone call, every pause that stretched on longer than normal was a signal that the truth I had sent out had landed exactly where it needed to, in the midst of a family that had spent decades pretending my presence and contributions were optional. By mid-morning, I received a single response from my Aunt Lila, who wrote simply, "They have received it. You did exactly what was necessary." Nothing more, nothing less, and in that one line I felt the solid weight of validation I had never received from my parents, a confirmation that my decision was justified and that the clarity I had enforced was both necessary and inevitable. And though I felt a flicker of relief, it was immediately accompanied by a rush of anxiety about how my parents would react, because even when you know you are right, the anticipation of confrontation from people who have always held power over your life creates an almost physical pressure that tightens in your chest and makes your fingers tremble as if your body is preparing for a fight that has already begun in your mind. By the time my phone buzzed in the early afternoon, I had constructed at least 3 different scenarios for their response, ranging from frantic apologies and desperate attempts to explain away their behavior, to cold detachment and silent withdrawal, to the most likely outcome, which I now recognized as the pattern of control they had perfected over decades: denial, gaslighting, and then a slow, creeping manipulation to reclaim dominance. But when I finally saw the email, my stomach dropped. Because it contained none of the expected pleas, none of the excuses, and none of the attempts at charm that usually masked their intentions. Instead, it was empty, a message composed of nothing more than a blank subject line with no body. And I realized immediately that this was not a technical error, but a deliberate statement, the kind that had always been their strategy. When faced with facts that could not be twisted, they would retreat into silence, hoping that inaction and the absence of acknowledgement would either confuse or intimidate me into second-guessing my own reality. As the hours passed, I noticed the subtle signs of their unease manifesting in ways I had not anticipated, like the sudden lack of updates on family group chats where they usually posted photos, the way my father avoided eye contact when we happened to be in the same room, the faint tension in my mother's voice when she asked trivial questions that carried no genuine concern but were instead attempts to gauge my emotional state and measure the impact of my actions, and in that moment I understood more clearly than ever that the leverage I had reclaimed by presenting unalterable facts was not a tool that forced immediate apologies or admissions, but it had shifted the axis of power. And now every interaction carried the weight of undeniable truth, and they would be forced to navigate their own discomfort without the crutch of gaslighting me or dismissing my feelings. By evening, the tension reached a peak when my brother, who had been the most shielded by my parents' generosity and often the one least aware of the financial manipulation I had endured, approached me under the guise of casual conversation. Yet his tone betrayed nervousness, a mixture of curiosity and fear that he had never felt in relation to me before, and as he stumbled through his words, trying to sound indifferent while clearly attempting to extract information about what I had sent, I realized that the consequences of my actions were rippling beyond the immediate circle of my parents, affecting the broader network of relatives who had always assumed I was compliant, who had silently benefited from my willingness to accommodate without question, and in that realization, I felt a quiet sense of satisfaction, because for the first time, the imbalance that had been maintained for decades was beginning to dissolve under the pressure of unarguable truth, and although there was still uncertainty about what would come next, I knew that I had created a space where my own voice and choices mattered more than their habitual authority, and that recognition, in itself, was a victory that could not be taken away by silence or avoidance. The following morning, as I settled into my usual routine of coffee and reviewing my work, the The tension that had quietly settled over the household in the aftermath of my revelation became almost tangible, as though the air itself had grown heavier with unspoken words and calculated restraint, and I could feel that every movement I made, every call I received, and every glance exchanged across the room was now loaded with a subtle, almost electric awareness that nothing could return to the casual rhythm it had once had, because the ledger, the recordings, and the careful documentation of decades of imbalance had been delivered not just as evidence, but as a mirror reflecting back every misstep, every manipulation, every choice my parents had made that had privileged my brothers while undermining my agency, and in that reflection, the cracks that had long existed under the surface were beginning to show, faint at first, like hairline fractures in porcelain, but undeniable in their presence and significance. By late morning, I began to notice the ways in which my parents carefully constructed narratives, the ones they had spun for years to justify their favoritism and to diminish my accomplishments, were starting to falter. Not because they had admitted any wrongdoing or offered apologies, but because their usual tools of deflection and charm no longer had the same effect. As though the documentation had inoculated me against the patterns I had once accepted without resistance, and I watched with a mixture of satisfaction and curiosity as my mother, who had long been the more strategic and calculating of the two, moved through the house with an unusual deliberateness, her footsteps slower, her gaze sharper, and her voice, when she spoke, carrying an almost imperceptible tension that betrayed her awareness that the balance of power had shifted, however subtly, and that for the first time, the truth I had exposed had the potential to influence her behavior, decisions, and even the way she would attempt to interact with me going forward. Around mid-afternoon, the first direct sign of real impact emerged when my father, who had always been confident in his ability to control perception and dictate the terms of family interactions, approached me with a calculated calm, offering banal questions about my schedule, my work, and my future plans, but the way he phrased his words, the slight hesitation before he responded to my answers, and the rare vulnerability in his otherwise assured demeanor all signaled that he was measuring, recalculating, and attempting to understand the implications of my actions, and as he stood there, making sure his tone sounded casual while clearly analyzing my reactions, I realized that the ledger and audio files had done more than create a temporary disturbance. They had introduced an element of uncertainty into a system that had always operated under the illusion of control, and that uncertainty, once internalized, was beginning to erode the foundation on which my parents had maintained their authority over me and my brothers for decades, shifting the dynamics in ways that were no longer immediately visible but would manifest in every conversation, decision, and expectation in the weeks and months to come. Later that evening, the tension reached its first overt expression when my oldest brother, who had benefited the most from parental favoritism and who had always treated my contributions as secondary or disposable, approached me under the pretense of casual interaction, asking about minor family matters, shared acquaintances, and weekend plans, yet beneath the surface, his voice carried a mixture of apprehension and curiosity that revealed he was grappling with the implications of my recent actions, and as he spoke, carefully measuring every word while observing my reactions, I understood that the influence of the documentation was extending beyond my parents, subtly infiltrating the network of relationships they had maintained to reinforce their power and control, and that for the first time, he was forced to confront not just the facts themselves, but the realization that his position, which had always seemed secure and untouchable, was now vulnerable to the same scrutiny and honesty that had exposed the unfairness of our family dynamics, and in that realization, I felt a restrained sense of vindication, knowing that the chain of privilege and unquestioned authority had begun to unravel, leaving behind a space in which accountability, fairness, and clarity could begin to take root, even if only incrementally and unevenly, in a household that had long resisted acknowledgement of my worth and my autonomy. By nightfall, As the house settled into a quieter rhythm, I reflected on the subtle but unmistakable changes in interactions, tone, and energy that had emerged over the course of the day. Recognizing that the first cracks had appeared not in dramatic confrontations or overt admissions of guilt, but in the nuanced shifts, the hesitations, and the recalibrations that signaled awareness, and I understood that these early tremors of change, though small and easily overlooked by anyone not paying close attention, were the beginning of a process that had the potential to alter the long-standing dynamics that had constrained me for decades, and in that understanding, I allowed myself a moment of cautious optimism. Knowing that while the path ahead would be uncertain and likely fraught with resistance, the foundation of truth I had established was now solid, unyielding, and capable of withstanding the subtle pressures and manipulations that had once rendered me invisible in my own family. The following days unfolded with a tension that felt almost tangible, as though the air itself had absorbed the weight of the truths I had laid bare, and had become a medium through which every glance, every word, and every gesture was filtered, measured, and reinterpreted, and I found myself navigating a household where the familiar rhythms had been replaced by a cautious choreography of avoidance, tentative conversation, and unspoken acknowledgement, a space where my parents and brothers, who had once moved through life with unchallenged assumptions about their authority and entitlement, were now forced to reckon with the fact that their long-standing privileges had been disrupted, their manipulations no longer invisible, and that for the first time, I occupied a position in which my presence, my decisions, and my boundaries could no longer be dismissed without consequence or without scrutiny, and this shift, though subtle in its outward appearance, carried a weight that was both liberating and disorienting because it demanded of me a vigilance I had not anticipated, an awareness of how every interaction might ripple through a household that had been conditioned to resist accountability, and a patience to observe the slow, often imperceptible ways in which acknowledgement of wrongdoing might emerge, fluctuate, and eventually take root, if it ever would. I noticed that my parents, who had always prided themselves on their ability to manage perception and influence the narrative of our family's history, now approached their interactions with a new caution, a careful modulation of tone and demeanor that suggested they were continuously assessing the limits of their influence over me, testing how far they could reach before encountering resistance, and adjusting their strategies to navigate the boundaries I had established with deliberate clarity. And I watched as their confidence, once unshakable and absolute, became punctuated by moments of hesitation, rare admissions of uncertainty, and an occasional, almost imperceptible tremor in their attempts to reassert control, and in those moments, I recognized the profound impact of confronting a system that had long operated on imbalance, favoritism, and selective attention, and how even the most subtle shifts in awareness could create opportunities for meaningful change, or at the very least, for the recognition of truths that had been consistently ignored or dismissed for decades. My brothers, particularly the one who had always thrived on my parents' preferential treatment, began to navigate a terrain that was unfamiliar and fraught with unanticipated consequence. Their previous sense of entitlement tempered by the awareness that I was no longer a passive participant in the dynamics of our family, and I observed with a mixture of satisfaction, apprehension, and curiosity as they tested the boundaries I had imposed, oscillating between defiance, attempts at reconciliation, and strategic neutrality, each behavior revealing the complex interplay of pride, habit, and newly awakened recognition of the inequities that had shaped our shared history, and in these interactions, I discerned the delicate balance between asserting autonomy and maintaining civility, between fostering confrontation and allowing space for reflection. And I understood that the real measure of change would not manifest in immediate apologies or dramatic admissions of guilt, but in the consistent recalibration of behaviors, the subtle adjustments in approach, and the gradual erosion of the unquestioned hierarchies that had long dictated the emotional and material landscapes of our family life. One evening, as I sat quietly with a sense of resolve and reflection, I realized that the most significant transformation was not in the expressions of guilt or discomfort from those around me, nor in the superficial adjustments to their daily interactions, but in the emergence of a space in which my own sense of self, agency, and boundaries could exist without constant negotiation, diminishment, or dismissal. And I understood that this was not a victory in the conventional sense, nor a moment of public acknowledgement or celebration, but rather a profound, internal confirmation that the work of reclaiming my voice, asserting my worth, and insisting on fairness had fundamentally altered the architecture of our relationships, leaving behind a household where the weight of truth, the inevitability of accountability, and the presence of an unflinching witness in me had begun to shape behaviors, expectations, and the subtle currents of power, influence, and attention in ways that could no longer be ignored or taken for granted. By the end of the week, I noticed a quiet shift in the atmosphere that was both tangible and nuanced, a sense of restrained energy, careful observation, and tentative respect. Not expressed through overt declarations, but through a measured approach to communication, decision-making, and acknowledgement of my contributions, presence, and perspectives. And I felt a cautious sense of accomplishment not because I had changed them through confrontation or aggression, but because I had maintained my integrity, documented my truth, and acted with clarity, patience, and strategic awareness, allowing the consequences of long-standing imbalance to unfold organically, to be absorbed, and to reverberate through the family structure in a way that was undeniable, unalterable, and ultimately transformative, even if the full extent of that transformation would take time, reflection, and continued assertion to manifest fully, leaving me with the knowledge that the silence that followed the storm was not empty, but pregnant with potential, consequence, and the quiet, lasting power of truth finally recognized and respected.